Professor Michael Mandelbaum, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you and your viewers, Jacob.
So, Michael, we're going to talk about a highly controversial subject, which is American foreign policy. You have a splendid new book out, a short book that you wrote in response to one of your students' queries who asked you, where can I find a concise explication of the history of American foreign policy? And I guess you thought to yourself, well, there really isn't one. So you ended up writing it yourself, right?
That is true. It's a little bit more roundabout a story. This was a Vietnamese student who was sent by the Vietnamese Foreign Ministry to learn about American foreign policy. And since it was my responsibility to teach American foreign policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, he took all my courses and we became friendly. And he came in one day and he said, what's the one thing I can read to understand American foreign policy? So I rattled off a list of books and periodicals and newspapers. And he said, well, that's very helpful, but is there one thing I can read? And I was stumped. I couldn't think of anything. So I decided that I would try to write such a thing. And I started research. And I said to my wife one evening, in order to write this book, I need to learn the history of 18th and 19th century American foreign policy. I know 20th and 21st century history pretty well, but not the others. And she said, well, as long as you're going to do that, why don't you just write a history of American foreign policy? So I did, and that came out in 2022, and it's called The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy: Weak Power, Great Power, Superpower, Hyperpower. But having written that, I still thought that I needed a book that captured the essence in brief compass, and so I wrote The American Way of Foreign Policy. So it has a kind of complicated genealogy, but at last it's available, and it's designed to tell people what the essence of American foreign policy has been across 4 centuries, from the 18th to the 21st.
Now, Michael, the title of your book, The American Way of Foreign Policy, suggests that there is something uniquely American about its approach. Now, the realist school of thought in international relations tends to look askance at those kind of explanations. The realists would argue that all nations behave in a similar way to stimuli, that we live in an anarchic international system, that the domestic character of a regime is largely irrelevant to the way that it pursues foreign policy, that every state has its own integral national interests that it is seeking to pursue. But you argue in this book that that is, in fact, not the whole story. Tell us why.
Yes, well, you've put it very concisely, Jacob. The United States is like other countries in foreign policy in important ways, but here I compare foreign policies to human beings. All human beings are basically the same physiologically. They have the same body parts. Otherwise, the science and practice of medicine would not be possible. And all countries behave up to a point in a realist manner. But of course, all individual people are not the same. They have different personalities, which stem from different circumstances and different experiences. And that's true of foreign policy as well. And it's especially the case with the United States. The United States does practice and has practiced a foreign policy that differs from the foreign policies of most other countries most of the time in 3 ways. And these 3 distinctive features make up the core of the American way of foreign policy. So let me state them briefly. The United States has conducted an unusually ideological foreign policy. The spread of its own political ideas has been important to the United States. Now, most other countries, most of the time, have conducted foreign policies that are geared to power. This is, as you well stated, the realist paradigm. And that's been true of the United States as well. But in addition, the United States, where it has been possible, or where Americans have thought it has been possible, has sought to spread its own liberal ideas, individual liberty and democracy within countries. So that's one difference. A second difference is that the United States has conducted an unusually economic foreign policy in the sense that Americans have used economic instruments such as sanctions to try to achieve political goals. For most countries, most of the time, it's been the other way around. They've used political instruments, notably military force, in order to achieve economic goals. The conquest of empire, which is an age-old phenomenon, is an example. Countries would use their armed forces to conquer empires and then try to exploit their imperial possessions economically. And then the third enduring feature of American foreign policy from the 18th century to the 21st, which forms a chapter like the other two in the American way of foreign policy, is that the United States has conducted an unusually democratic foreign policy in the sense that the public and public opinion have had greater, wider, more intense, longer lasting influence on American foreign policy than has been normal in other countries. In most countries, for most of history, foreign policy was the preserve of a small elite. That has never been true in the United States. So those are the three features that define American foreign policy, in my view, and also distinguish it from the foreign policies of other countries, which means that the American way of foreign policy is an essay on American exceptionalism in foreign policy.
Now, you teach at Johns Hopkins, which had a number of realists in the past, Robert Osgood and David Caleo. Someone like Caleo, I think, would probably take issue with some of your contentions. Namely, if I remember correctly, Caleo wrote extensively on the U.S. in the 19th century and argued that it actually wasn't that different from Imperial Germany, which embarked upon 3 wars to consolidate itself and result in the reunification of Germany in 1871. And Caleo argued that American behavior in the 19th century actually wasn't that different, that we were a militarized society that was intent on conquest and actually in expansion. And that's what occurred. So what would you say to that?
Well, it's a very good point. David, the late, alas, David Caleo was a great scholar and a good friend and wonderful colleague for more than 2 decades. And he wrote a book called The German Problem Reconsidered, which you as a German scholar know well. And in it, he argued that there wasn't anything special about Germany, even German imperialism, that the Germans were trying to do what other countries had done. The United States being one with its continental expansion, Russia being another with its expansion across Eurasia, Britain and France also being examples when they acquired empires in the 19th century. David argued that Germany's misfortune was not that it was any different or worse than other countries, but that it engaged in imperial behavior in the wrong time and at the wrong place. And its imperial behavior, which went more or less unchallenged by other countries, caused 2 world wars. It was a controversial thesis, and I have some reservations about it, but David made some very good points, as he always did. I would say that in David's other work, he wasn't a strict realist, as strict realists themselves would identify themselves, because David studied contemporary Europe. He wrote a lot about the European Union. He was a great champion of the European Union, and the willingness of the European great powers, at least in Western Europe, to set aside their centuries-long quarrels and join together in an economic union which has become increasingly a political union defies realist wisdom. So in that sense, I think David would be more on my side than on the side of the realists, although as a capacious scholar, he took from different traditions what he thought was appropriate.
So you just argued that elites, that we have not had a tradition of small elites guiding American foreign policy, say as you've had in Germany or Japan. But isn't that contradicted by American history in the 20th century, at least? That you had the formation of the Inquiry Commission with Walter Lippmann in 1917, when America had entered the war, and trying to draw upon elites, academics, and so forth to devise a plan for post-war Europe. You have the rise of the so-called wise men after World War II, the so-called establishment, which comes to grief in the Vietnam War. You've had the neoconservatives. You can debate the extent of their influence, but another elite phenomenon. So doesn't that contradict your contention that elites have not actually had the overriding influence and that the public has actually not influenced American foreign policy that much?
Well, you make a very good point, and I think I would put it that it supplements my point. Elites in the United States, as in other countries, have had a disproportionate role in formulating and initiating foreign policies. We don't take a plebiscite for every foreign policy that the United States carries out. That's, I think, more or less inevitable. Where the public has been more important in American foreign policy than in the foreign policies of other countries is in passing judgment on and ratifying or overturning those foreign policies. And we see that in what is generally the most important foreign policy of all, namely war. Elites have started wars, but the American public, when it was not satisfied with the course of those wars, has forced their discontinuation. And that's been particularly marked in the 20th century. The public turned against the Korean War, forced President Harry Truman, who was presiding over it, to step down, or at least not to run for a third term, which was then constitutionally permitted, and really impelled Dwight Eisenhower, his successor, to find a negotiated end to the war. It was also true in the Vietnam War, which President John Kennedy initiated. President Lyndon Johnson presided over it. The country turned against it. It forced Johnson not to run again for president. His successor as the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, was defeated by Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon was in effect under orders from the public to wind down the war, which he eventually did. It was also true of the Iraq War, which became unpopular. President George W. Bush started it, presided over it. He was succeeded by a Democrat, Barack Obama, who did his best to bring the American participation in the war to an end. Incidentally, Americans have turned against war in the 20th century, not because they disagreed with the goals for which the wars were being fought. Americans always believed that keeping South Korea out of communist control and South Vietnam away from communist domination and trying to make Iraq a peaceful democracy were worthy goals. But as those wars went on, the American public decided they'd become too expensive, and most importantly, expensive in American lives. And so they said, through their votes to the American government, you have to stop this, and the American government did. So it might be said for foreign policy in the United States, the executive branch, the elites, propose, but the public disposes. The elites say, here's what we're going to do, and we're going to do it. And the public says, we'll decide whether that's okay or not. You show us that it works according to our standards, and we'll be okay with it. But if it doesn't, you're out of here, and somebody else will have to come in and clean up the mess.
Is the root of the issue, and I think you make a good point, but is the root of the issue that these wars have been inefficacious, that we simply, in Richard Hofstadter's words, Uncle Sam has cried uncle?
Yes, that's true. But Uncle Sam has cried uncle not because the other side prevailed militarily, but because Uncle Sam made a cost-benefit calculation and decided that the costs were exceeding any benefits that might accrue. The combined forces of China and North Korea in the Korean War could not defeat the American army. The Vietnamese communists could not defeat the American army. The insurgents in Iraq could not defeat the American army. But they could exact casualties to the point at which the average American said, this isn't really worthwhile. And incidentally, the public was able to say that because these were not wars of existential consequence for the United States. Getting out of those wars did not bring the military forces that the United States was fighting to American shores. That is why there was public tolerance for significant casualties in World War II, because the stakes seemed so high. And that was true for a while in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was seen as fighting terrorism. And on September 11, 2001, terrorists had actually attacked the United States. It wasn't true for Iraq, and therefore the public had less patience for Iraq than for Afghanistan.
Now, another point that would corroborate your thesis about elites and the public is, of course, the vehement opposition to entering World War II that existed in the 1930s after what was perceived as the failure of World War I to instill democracy around the world, let alone in Europe. So we do have a strong isolationist tradition in this country that goes along with the liberal internationalism that you describe in your book. What is your perception of the vigor of the isolationist, or if you want to, contemporary languages, restraint?
Yes. Well, that's a very good question because it points toward the future. Let me make 2 points here. First, an historical point, which is one of the important themes of the American way of foreign policy, and that is every single American war, without exception, and I count 12 significant wars in the book, has evoked opposition and dissent. That was true in the Revolutionary War, where a number of the colonials fought on the side of the British, and those who were pro-British decamped to Canada. But it's been true throughout. World War II was significant because the opposition came before the war, not afterward.
Right.
But there's been opposition throughout. So anti-war dissent is as American as apple pie. Now, on the issue of isolation, I think a better term, and one that historians generally prefer, is non-intervention. Americans never wanted to be cut off from the world entirely and never thought that that was feasible. From the very beginning, from independence, they wanted to trade throughout the world, but they did not want to become involved in European politics. They thought that was a losing proposition. Now, it's important to note that non-interventionism, all the way through the 19th century and up to 1917, when the United States sent troops to Europe to fight in World War I, was partly conditioned by the fact that compared to the great powers of Europe, the United States was weak. And so if the United States joined a coalition, it would inevitably be a junior partner. And American leaders, starting with George Washington, feared that as a junior partner, the United States would be manipulated and its interests would be sacrificed. George Washington fully appreciated that the United States could never have won the Revolutionary War without France, but he didn't really trust the French. And although the colonists had made a commitment not to make a separate peace with Great Britain, they went ahead and did so without the French coming along. So there was a suspicion of entangling alliances or permanent alliances throughout the 19th century and involvement in the affairs of Europe. But I think a lot of that had to do, not everything, but a lot had to do with American weakness. And indeed, in his farewell address, where George Washington warned against permanent alliances, he also said, in a phrase that is not as often cited as it should be, "We're weak now," I'm paraphrasing, "but someday we'll be strong, and then we'll have other options." And when the United States did become strong, and by 1917 it had the largest economy in the world, it did pursue other options. But, as you say, withdrawal from Europe is an option for the United States in a way that it isn't, of course, for the Europeans. And after World War II, it wasn't clear that the United States would remain in Europe. If it weren't for what Stalin did in Eastern Europe, the United States might have brought all the troops home and kept them home. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, at the end of his life, in dealing with Joseph Stalin at the summit conference in Yalta, took his cue and was deeply influenced by the presumption that the United States would not stay in Europe, that the Soviet Union would be the dominant power there, and that the United States would have to try to craft arrangements around that fact. Now we have a president, Mr. Trump, who seems less committed to an ongoing presence in Europe than have been all the presidents since Harry Truman. We don't know what consequences that will have either in his term of office or afterward, but it has to be said that in criticizing, if not repudiating, the American presence in Europe, he is drawing on an older tradition of American foreign policy.
Now, you emphasize in your book one of the attributes that you think makes American foreign policy or its approach to foreign policy unique is that it does not pursue economic ends in themselves, but uses economics as a tool. Can you expand upon that?
Yes. The dominant mode of international economic policy when the United States became independent was called mercantilism. And the idea was that countries should use their foreign policies to benefit themselves economically. There was the view that a trade balance, a positive balance of trade, was the desired end for international economic policy. And Adam Smith wrote his landmark 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, in part to repudiate that notion. And the United States never embraced mercantilism, in part because the Americans felt that they had been the victims of mercantilism. The so-called Navigation Acts had cut the colonists partly off from trading with other countries, which would have been to their benefit. Incidentally, the colonials were not as penalized by British mercantilist policy as they might have been because they were scofflaws. They simply ignored British laws when they found it inconvenient. So, and the United States was not powerful enough to practice mercantilism. And throughout American history, Americans have not adopted the view that American trade policy should emphasize a trade surplus, although Mr. Trump has adopted that view. I give as an example in the book the American war in Iraq, where the United States did not, as a mercantilist country would have done, wage the war in order to seize and benefit from Iraqi oil. That was never an issue. And just recently, Mr. Trump declared, by the time this reaches the audience, this may be null and void, and in fact, he's already reversed himself. He declared that the United States would clear the Strait of Hormuz, would patrol it, and would charge tolls for ships transiting the strait. That is very much contrary to the American tradition. Freedom of the seas has been basic to the United States from the very beginning. And in fact, the United States went to war twice in order to enforce freedom of the seas. The War of 1812 against the British was fought because the British were interfering with American merchant shipping, and the United States entered World War I in 1917 in response to Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which was sinking merchant ships. And so, sure enough, after Mr. Trump declared this policy, a few days later, he was forced to retract it. So there you have, I think, another example of the American tradition of economic policy at work.
I wanted to ask you about Mr. Trump, whose name you've alluded to several times now. Does not his approach to foreign policy contradict, if not flout, the precepts that you talk about in this book? Doesn't Trump show that, in fact, you're talking about an older way of American foreign policy? And has he inaugurated a new age or return to an older tradition of foreign policy realism, in which he pursues imperialist goals, such as taking over Venezuela? He's got an energy-dominated foreign policy. He wants to control Iran's supply of oil. He's outright suggested that, not just intimated it. Have we embarked upon a return to the old spheres of influence under Trump?
Well, that's a very important question, and the first response to it is to cite a line attributed, possibly apocryphally, to the Chinese communist leader Zhou Enlai, who in the 1970s is supposed to have been asked what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said, "It's too soon to say." We don't know what will come after.
Yesterday was Bastille Day, by the way.
Yes, and I think the French national soccer team lost on Bastille Day. It's impossible to imagine an American team in international competition losing on the 4th of July, but that's a separate issue. Well, let me make one point about the book. The book's argument is that the three enduring features of American foreign policy encompass both the old and the new foreign policy, both the pre and the post-1945 policy, so that when it comes to America's ideological foreign policy, the United States has always pursued it, although prior to the 20th century, it sought to spread American ideas and American values by force of example, not by direct intervention.
Now, the critics, I'm going to jump in here, the critics of American foreign policy in Beijing and in Moscow, including Mr. Putin, will deride and scorn all of this talk about liberal internationalism. They argue that it's a smokescreen for American power. The idea of National Endowment for Democracy, these are all weapons for spreading American influence. And Trump has simply stripped away the veneer.
Well, they do say that, and they would say that because they are fearful of the political ideas that the United States seeks to disseminate. The United States is often accused of hypocrisy, of using, as you elegantly put it, its ideas as a smokescreen. I think the United States has been inconsistent. It has often followed a realist policy. It has sometimes allied itself with emphatically undemocratic regimes, such as its alliance with the Soviet Union in World War II. But where it has been possible, Americans have genuinely sought to spread liberal ideas. For example, take the post-Cold War era, where the United States was at its zenith in terms of power, and this was the golden age of America's ideological foreign policy. It practiced humanitarian intervention, it practiced nation building or state building, which I prefer to call it, where it sought to spread American political ideas. And in the places where it intervened, it had nothing to gain, and indeed gained nothing. The humanitarian interventions brought the United States nothing geopolitically or economically. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq did not benefit the United States geopolitically. So I think that its critics are wrong to say that the United States has always used its ideological proclamations as a smokescreen. It has certainly pursued power, and it has certainly fought wars for realist goals. But in my view, looking back over American foreign policy over the course of 250 years, as I describe in The American Way of Foreign Policy, and as I document at greater length in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, it really works the other way around. That is, it's not that the United States has used its values as a screen for a realist foreign policy, but rather that the United States has undertaken realist foreign policies as a way of trying to promote its values. And indeed, if you look at the 3 great conflicts the United States waged in the 20th century, the 2 world wars and the Cold War, those were power political wars. Those had to do with considerations of security, concerns that if America's adversaries won, they would decisively set back American interests. But those were also wars of ideas. In all 3 cases, the United States believed that it was defending the principle of democracy and countries that practice democracy. And in all 3 cases, it was correct. World War I gives the lie to the realists, the Chinese, and the Russian charge as well. Wilson proclaimed these goals. He tried to implement them. He tried to implement his idealist goals at the Paris Peace Conference. And although the United States was one of the winning powers, it did not collect the power and the influence that it might have. It could have stayed in Europe and been a European great power, but it didn't. It went home. Realists and the Chinese communists and Putin would never have predicted that, and they cannot explain it.
Well, as we know, there are lots of problems with the realist model. I think it was John Mearsheimer who predicted in 1990 or 92 after German reunification that France and Germany would be at war within 20 years. So, I mean, it's foreign policy realism is useful, but it has its limitations.
It does indeed. The realists remind me of the joke about economists, that they've predicted 10 out of the last 5 recessions. Political scientists are not very good at predictions, myself emphatically included, so people should beware of their predictions. But the realists are people who sometimes, and the person you've cited is a very good example, who insist that nations must behave the way they believe nations do behave. There's another academic joke that makes this point. It's about the once well-known French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss did field work in South America, and he came up with some very complicated examples of how culture actually worked. They were interesting, but they didn't seem to apply to any other part of the world. And somebody once remarked that Lévi-Strauss was very lucky to have found a tribe that thought just the way he did.
Speaking of American idealism and realism and our friend John Mearsheimer, let's talk about Israel for a second, because America has, at least since the 1960s, been a fairly staunch advocate for Israel, increasingly in the 70s and 80s. Now we're seeing something of a rebellion. I think over 100 House Democrats voted against extending military aid to Israel at this moment, including former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Then on the right, Vice President J.D. Vance is citing a Time magazine piece about an alleged Israeli influence campaign to undermine the what Vance sees as his work to promote peace between Iran and the United States. So we're seeing a backlash against Israel on both the right and the left in the United States. Where do you think that's headed?
Well, it's an important question for those of us who are concerned about Israel and who are strongly favorably disposed toward Israel. A couple of points here. First of all, I do have a section in the American Way of Foreign Policy about the Israel lobby. And I explained that the Israel lobby is no different from any other lobby. It is engaging in activities that are protected by the First Amendment. So the Israeli lobby, or the pro-Israel lobby, is as American as apple pie. And the United States has supported Israel when it has supported Israel, and it hasn't always supported Israel, but it has done so because Israel was serving America's strategic purposes. Israel was combating America's adversaries in the Middle East. So this was very useful to the United States geopolitically. And Israel is also a country, the only one in the Middle East, which practices American values. It's the only democracy. So the United States was for Israel, has been for Israel, because backing Israel serves American interests and American values. And that is still true. Why this anti-Israel backlash? I'm not. We don't know how lasting it is. It comes from the left wing of the Democratic Party. That's what's new. There's always been anti-Israel sentiment on the right, although it
is increasingly vociferous on the right.
Well, it is.
Someone like Tucker Carlson, for example, didn't exist. Or wasn't saying these things publicly.
Well, people said them, not just so loudly. There was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment in the 30s.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And in the 50s, Eisenhower forced Israel to retreat from Suez. So this is nothing new. The American-Israeli relationship has had its ups and downs. I would say one thing that I think it's important to note about the recent outburst of anti-Israeli sentiment, and that is that the basis for it on the left within the Democratic Party is a series of assertions that are false. That is, it is now said in Democratic circles that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. That is simply false. Genocide is the effort to wipe out an entire people. The Israelis have never even thought of trying to wipe out all Palestinians. And in fact, the evidence for that is there are 2 million Arab citizens of Israel, and they have full civic rights. They can vote. They serve as judges. They're doctors. The only place in the Middle East where Arabs can vote. And the 2 million Arab citizens of Israel are as much Palestinians as people who live in Gaza and the West Bank. So the idea that Israel is committing genocide is, not to put too fine a point on it, a lie. Now, Israel has also been criticized for its campaign in Gaza, and here it's important to note that there are customary laws of warfare to which Israel has confirmed. It has obeyed the laws of war more strictly than any country ever, including the United States. There are two basic laws of war. One is what is called jus ad bellum, that is, it has to be a just cause. the quintessential just cause is self-defense, and that's what the Israelis were doing. They were attacked on October 7th, and they were fighting back. So that is permitted under any definition of international law. The second basic conventional international law is called jus in bello. You have to fight in a just way, and that comes down to avoiding civilian casualties wherever possible, and that the Israelis did. When they were going to attack an area where Hamas was dug in, they notified civilians and allowed them to move. They facilitated the supply of food to civilians. Civilian casualties were high because Hamas deliberately ensured that they would be. Hamas put military forces in hospitals, in schools, in homes, and the Israelis could either allow them to be there or they could warn people and then destroy them. And they did so. And the best estimates of civilian casualties, of the ratio of civilian casualties, put the ratio of military, that is Hamas casualties to civilian casualties is about 1-to-1. In that kind of fighting, in urban fighting, historically, it's been about 4-to-1. In the American campaign in Iraqi cities against the Islamic terrorists there, it was 4 or 5-to-1. So the Israelis have fought a more moral war in Gaza than anybody else has ever fought. And incidentally, Hamas, which attacked Israel with the idea of killing all the Jews there, and which deliberately created civilian casualties, is in fact guilty of war crimes in a way that Israel is not. Now, for some reason, the Democratic Party doesn't know that or has refused to accept it, and that certainly represents a failure, but those are the facts. That to summarize, the most common criticisms of Israel are in fact diametrically untrue.
Let me ask you as a final question. Pivoting away from Israel, that was a very eloquent defense.
Based on the facts,
yeah.
I say.
I wanted to ask you, I was just thinking about Israel's position as a small power, and then there's been a controversy that has sort of erupted around Elbridge Colby, who has been scolding some of the European powers for trying to emancipate themselves from the United States and buy their own military weapons rather than from the United States. Do you think that Trump's focus on nationalism and America first and his open contempt for NATO will help usher in or accelerate the rise of a world in which countries like Germany and France say, well, Germany first. We have the rise of the AfD in Germany, polling at 28%, whereas the Christian Democrats, traditionally the biggest party in Germany, are at 21%. Do you think Trump is creating a world in which these so-called middle powers will seek to emancipate themselves from the U.S. and pursue their own interests?
Well, very good questions. I can't help but observe that the Europeans cannot win with the Trump people. On the one hand, they're criticized for not doing enough.
That's what I'm driving at, yeah.
And on the other hand, they're criticized for trying to do too much.
Yeah.
The criticism that they're not doing enough is one that goes back to President Eisenhower. In fact, it goes back to the time when Dwight Eisenhower was the first supreme Allied commander in Europe. The Europeans have always underperformed militarily. That's an old story, and every American president has urged them to do more. Mr. Trump has been rather more vociferous and has accompanied that urging with threats. He might argue that the Europeans are doing more, and only his way of going about trying to get them to do more has succeeded. We don't know how much they will be able to do. I would say 2 points. First, if a middle or weak power believes that it cannot depend on the United States as it has done since 1945, it has one obvious course to follow, and that's to get nuclear weapons. So the end of the American alliance system is a surefire recipe for nuclear proliferation. Now, I believe that Mr. Trump has said off and on that that doesn't worry him. It has worried every president since President Kennedy. It would certainly be a new and different world. It's hard to imagine that it would be a safer one. The second point I would make here is that although some middle powers talk a good game, I'm thinking of Canada and their Prime Minister Mark Carney, who made a celebrated speech at Davos saying, we middle powers must get together. I'm not very confident that that will happen. Certainly not going to be led by Canada if there is a middle power bloc. And Canada, incidentally, has free security because they're part of North America. And so American defense extends to North America and includes them. It may be that the Europeans will do more. They're certainly trying. That requires greater political integration, and they're moving slowly and crabwise in that direction. It's conceivable that at some point the world will be tripolar with China, Russia, not Russia. Russia is not strong enough, so it'll be China, the United States, and Europe. But we're a very, very long way from that, and I don't feel confident in predicting it. But then, going back to what I said previously, I don't feel confident about predicting anything.
Well, on that pensive note, I think we'll end our discussion, and I urge anyone watching to purchase and read Michael's excellent new book.